have two people presenting Drought Project, Jamie McEvoy and Molly Cross. I'll introduce both of them, and I think Molly's going to start, right? Okay, well, I'll start with you. Molly is the Director of Climate Change Adaptation for the America's program of the Wildlife Conservation Society. Her work brings together science experts and conservation practitioners to incorporate climate change adaptation science into on-the-ground conservation actions. Molly has contributed to several national climate change efforts, including the U.S. National Climate Assessment, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies' guidance on incorporating climate change into state wildlife action plans, and Climate Smart Conservation Guide to Climate Adaptation. She is the Director of Science for the WCS Climate Adaptation Fund, which supports applied project demonstrating effective interventions for wildlife adaptation. Molly received a PhD in environmental science, policy, and management from the University of California, Berkeley. Jamie is a human environmental geographer in our science department with expertise in water management and climate change adaptation in the water sector. As a social scientist, she uses the political ecology framework to understand the political, economic, and institutional dimensions of conflict and cooperation over water resources. Most recently, her Montana-based research has focused on, first, public perception of natural water storage as a climate change adaptation strategy, and second, drought planning in the upper Missouri Headwater Basin. So her background, education background is a Master of Science in Sociology and a PhD in Geography from the University of Arizona. So thank you all for coming and for presenting today, and looking forward to hearing what you
have. Thanks, Bruce. So some of you may have noticed that I just rushed into the room. It's a little later than I'd planned. I had to take my daughter to the doctor's this morning, but it's not as bad as at the Society for Conservation Biology conference this summer, when I, at the last minute, had to give my colleague's presentation and looked at it about 5 minutes before I gave it. So hopefully I'll be able to jump right in here better than I did there. So I'm going to give sort of an introduction to this larger project within which Jamie has been leading and collaborating on a number of key pieces. So I want to try to set the stage with a little bit of the bigger picture of what we're trying to do with this work. And then hopefully it's a nice segue to Jamie talking about some of the details of some of the, in particular, some of the social science work that this collaborative working group has been focused on for the last couple of years. So this is a project focused on ecological drought and how we can improve our understanding of ecological effects of drought in a way that helps us better prepare people and nature for the effects of droughts of the future. And this is a collaboration primarily funded by the USGS, but in partnership with my organization, the Wildlife Conservation Society, the Nature Conservancy, and it's all under the umbrella of a larger initiative called SNAP, which stands for Science for Nature and People Partnership. SNAP is housed at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis in Santa Barbara, and is an initiative in collaboration with WCS and TNC to bring together working groups that try to advance science synthesis to tackle issues at the interface of human well-being and nature conservation. So our Ecological Drought Working Group is one working group within that SNAP umbrella. Now, it's challenging sometimes to talk about drought in a non-drought year. In a year when we're laying down a really nice snowpack up in our mountain systems, nice and early in the year. But in fact, that's exactly when we should be talking about drought. And that's exactly when we should be thinking about how do we prepare for the next drought that we know is coming. It's a matter of when, and it's likely to be happening more often, and it's likely to be happening in more intense droughts, especially given climate change. And so now is the time where we're really trying to work quite closely with partners here in the upper Missouri Headwaters, but also other regions, to try to be more proactive in how we plan for and prepare for the effects of drought. And there are two major sort of threats that this working group was brought together to address. The first is that drought is a big concern for some people in some places, But we're concerned that we may not be always adequately preparing for droughts, and in particular droughts of the future. Because we don't always consider all of the ecological effects of drought. We focus more on agricultural effects of drought, direct effects on water supply. There's much less of a focus on ecological drought, especially in the drought planning world. We're also concerned that we're not adequately considering how climate change and human water use and demand changes are affecting the availability of water into the future. We're also concerned, the second threat is that when people are preparing for drought, we're concerned that they're not always doing it in ways that serve to bolster healthy ecosystems. But in fact, some of the actions we might take to protect human communities and economies from drought may in fact degrade healthy ecosystems. Whether it's increasing our use of irrigation water from groundwater supplies, which can have negative impacts on wetlands and other groundwater dependent systems, or putting in high elevation reservoirs and water storage, which can obviously heavily impact aquatic ecosystems. So we are interested in trying to do more to reveal strategies for drought preparedness that can provide mutual benefits to people and nature, not necessarily so many negative trade-offs. So with those sort of major threats in mind, we pulled together an interdisciplinary working group to try to address this issue. We brought together some of the disciplines that we think are necessary for thinking about these issues. So we have individuals that work on ecology. So there's ecologists, there are hydrologists, folks who work on fire, folks who work on aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. But we also felt it was really important to bring in a number of different social sciences. And I'm so pleased that I was able to talk Jamie into joining our team. So we have sort of the human environmental geography perspective. We have folks with expertise in decision science. We also have individuals like myself that work on how do we plan for the effects of a changing climate, climate adaptation planning. We also have individuals that work very closely with human communities on drought planning. So we sort of brought all these disciplines together to try to tackle these issues. And we're working on sort of three main bodies of work. The first that I'll talk about in a minute is developing a social and ecological framework for thinking about ecological drought that we suggest can help communities better prepare for droughts of the future. We've also been doing social science and ecological science and modeling to analyze the ecological impacts of drought and connect those impacts to drought management strategies that can benefit both people and nature. And we're trying to take all this conceptual information and really field test it here in the Upper Missouri Headwaters, where there's been a real focus on drought planning and real efforts to advance drought planning. So I'll talk about that a little bit later in my presentation as well. So starting first with some of the concepts of how do we think about ecological drought as a coupled human and natural system. We laid out this definition of ecological drought and the socio-ecological framework in this paper last year. And I'm gonna sort of give you some of the highlights. Obviously, you can read more of the details in this paper. But we start with the definition. As an episodic deficit in ecologically available water that drives ecosystems beyond some threshold of vulnerability such that there's an impact to ecosystem services that trigger feedbacks in natural and human systems. So what does that all mean? We've sort of tried to sketch it out a little bit more visually and get into some of the components of vulnerability and drivers of ecological drought through our framework. And so I'll walk through it in a little bit of a cartoonish way and then provide a little more detailed version that's actually in the paper. So our framework is oriented around two main axes. We talked about this sort of thresholds of ecological vulnerability. So this first threshold, the first axis sort of up and down is the components of vulnerability. Exposure to a deficit in ecologically available water, in combination with the ecosystem's sensitivity or ability to adapt to that exposure. So for example, some forests, some species are more drought tolerant than others. So that maybe some species are more sensitive than others. And that when there's adequate exposure combined with adequate sensitivity and a lack of adaptive capacity, we have some sort of ecological drought impact. And then the second axis is that sort of coupling of human and natural systems, where we're not just interested in ecological drought impacts because of the way it affects ecosystems for their own right, but also because it can affect people. And then again, those feedbacks that I mentioned, where both natural ecosystem responses to drought, but also human community responses to drought. How do we respond within a drought? How could we think about some of those opportunities for proactively responding to drought even before it happens? So this is the more detailed framework that's laid out in the manuscript, and I'll walk through it a little bit. At the top, again, we have this component of exposure to a deficit in ecologically available water. And we considered not only, primarily when individuals are doing drought planning, we think most about the meteorological drought conditions that occur. But in fact, where you are in the landscape, what sort of slope aspect, whether you're in a relatively dry or relatively wet area can affect how much water is available or not during a drought. Also, anthropogenic climate change is changing the trajectory and frequency and severity of droughts, as are human land and water use. When we think about sensitivity, again, there are natural ecological components. Like I said, some tree species are more drought tolerant than others, but also how we manage those forests can influence the impact that might occur in that forest. If we're thinning the forests, they may not become as stressed during a drought. Other kinds of management actions can also influence whether a forest area is highly sensitive or less sensitive to drought. And again, when we cross those thresholds of vulnerability and experience an ecological impact, we care not only about the ecological impacts for their own sake, but also because of the way it can affect people. And here we use the framing of ecosystem services, and it's a very broad sense of any kind of value that people might get from a healthy ecosystem can be compromised during times of drought. And again, those feedbacks represent some of those opportunities for proactive drought preparedness actions that can provide benefits to both people and nature, or at least minimize the negative trade-offs. So this is the kind of conceptual work that our working group has done in pulling this idea together. But really, the bulk of the work has really been focused on, so does this really help us be better prepared for drought? Does it help natural resource managers? Does it help human communities better prepare for the effects of drought? And so that's been the focus of the sort of last year and a half of work and continuing work right now. And again, so we're trying to do some science to understand the ecological effects of drought, link those ecological effects to solutions that can benefit both people and nature. And again, we're trying to field test that here in the Upper Missouri Headwaters. So one of the reasons why we've chosen to work with our partners, in particular Anne Schwend at the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation in Montana, is because there's a targeted drought preparedness effort going on in Montana. And it was at the time, and it originated under President Obama as a White House initiative. They pulled together this national drought resilience partnership, and Montana very quickly stood up and said, we really want to pilot how this actually works. How do states work better with the feds? And how do states work better with local watershed group partners to actually advance drought preparedness? So we have had the great luck and pleasure of getting to be doing our work and integrating our work into the ongoing drought planning efforts here in Montana. And there are some discussions about statewide drought plan. Anne is in charge of developing a drought plan for this Upper Missouri Headwaters Basin. And each individual watershed in here is also moving forward at various stages in the process of developing a drought plan or revising an older drought plans if they already have. But it's happening at multiple scales. So again, we're trying to do some science to try to help inform this effort. Jamie's going to talk a lot more about the various avenues of social science work that we have underway, interviews with various partners involved in this Montana demonstration project for the National Drought Resilience Partnership, trying to get at what impacts are you concerned about, what are your perceptions of drought, what kinds of strategies are you already implementing. Jamie and her colleagues have also been leading an analysis of natural resource management plans and drought plans in the area to see, are we considering ecological effects? If so, how are we already considering them? What might be missing? And then with our colleague Nejim Rahim at Emerson College in Massachusetts, he's an environmental economist who's been helping us identify ecosystem services of value to people in the Upper Missouri Headwaters and start to think about which of those may be especially sensitive or impacted by drought. On the more analytical modeling side, my colleague Shelley Crosby at Conservation Science Partners is looking at historic drought events to get at what are the most important drivers. If we look at all those different drivers on our conceptual diagram, our socio-ecological framework, which of those were the strongest drivers of a historic drought impact. In this case, she's looking at forest mortality in this region using remotely sensed data. And then looking at sort of which of the different drivers, drought conditions, meteorological drought conditions, landscape characteristics, ecological characteristics, human water use. Some of these variables have been harder for her to get spatial data on than others, but she's doing her best to try to bring in those different components of our framework to look at which were the major drivers of the past drought, to then think about what are the drivers that we can focus on for our interventions. So if human water use is seen as a major driver of a past of drought in a certain ecosystem type, well, maybe we could be thinking about different kinds of water conservation strategies, ways to reduce water use. If ecological characteristics, if forest canopy is coming out as a major driver of the forest mortality event in the early 2000s, maybe there are some strategies for thinning or altering the forest community composition or structure in ways that could boost the resilience of these ecosystems in future droughts. So again, really important that we're not just understanding how ecosystems are affected, but what does that mean in terms of management options? And that's another piece that Jamie's been working on, which is to say, can we catalog what are some of the different kinds of drought and adaptation strategies that are out there that can maybe provide more mutual benefits to people and nature? I'll talk a little more about that as well. So as you can see, this is a very multifaceted project. There are a huge number of collaborators involved. It's been a really exciting body of work. It's been exciting to work on it at the same time as drought planning is happening here in Montana. And so I'm looking forward to Jamie being able to share some of the specific results on some of these different pieces that are going on that she's been most involved in. Thanks. And I think maybe, I mean, I could pause for questions, but we can also wait. If there's any burning questions right now, I suppose I could do. Thank you, Mallory.
All right, well, thanks so much for setting that up, and also thank you for making it end such a crazy, hectic day for you. She did a much better job than I could ever do setting up that larger framework for the project. So I'm going to dive into, as Molly said, some of the social science work that has been done. And I want to start out by talking about drought perceptions and impacts, which kind of fall under the ecological vulnerability assessment. So first we wanted to know, how do people define drought? Specifically in the upper Missouri Headwaters, how do people talk about drought? What do they see as the drivers and impacts of drought? And to what extent do they think about the ecological impacts of drought? And I want to pause for a moment and just explain why we think this is important, why we think how people perceive and think about drought is important. And this comes from another diagram in our conceptual paper. Molly outlined the framework, but this diagram is looking at 4 different types of drought. And so a type 1 drought would be a drought that just impacts the natural system. A type 2 drought would impact the human system through impacts on ecosystem services. A type 3 drought would be a drought that affects both natural and human communities. And then a type 4 drought is a transformational drought that has more extreme impacts on both natural and human communities. So we wanted to understand how people's perception of drought, including their definition of drought and the impacts that they're concerned about, might make a manager or a planner more attuned to seeing a type 1, 2, or 3 drought on the landscape. And so in a moment of brainstorming genius, my colleague Amanda Cravens sort of sketched out this on a whiteboard, and our team had dubbed it, when she presented it to the larger team, the Eye of Sauron diagram. I haven't seen Lord of the Rings, but this usually gets a laugh at this idea. But the idea is that a type 3 drought could be occurring on the landscape, and a type 3 drought has both impacts to human communities and natural communities. So say human communities blue, natural communities red. But if a water manager or a planner is only attuned to or is concerned about or using indicators that point to impacts to human communities, they might be sort of perceiving and seeing the drought as a type 2 drought, Or conversely, if they're just looking at the impacts to ecosystems and only using indicators that might pick up those impacts, it would, be this type 1 drought. Or, are we seeing, and our managers seeing both of those impacts, a type 3 drought? So in terms of methods, as Molly mentioned, we have done a series of interviews, and we used as our sampling frame this set of partners that are part of the Montana National Drought Resiliency Partnership. And it's a bit of alphabet soup, lots of different agencies and organizations, federal, state, local, government, non-governmental. But we interviewed representatives from 44 of these organizations. And just as a side note in this interdisciplinary audience, one thing that we did on all of our interviews, they were mostly phone interviews, a few in person, but for every interview we had both a social scientist and an ecologist on the phone call from our research team. And that was a new experience for me and really cool. I loved hearing the types of follow-up questions that our ecologists would ask, and hopefully vice versa. They found the questions that social scientists would ask helpful. And even, before we started the interviews, just that back and forth going over the protocol, the set of questions that we were going to ask. And, Liz Shanahan's here, and we have an interdisciplinary team. And I think just sitting in a room with folks from different disciplines trying to think of better ways to ask a question, or how might someone else understand this question, or, just realizing that, for months you've actually been talking about the question like this, but hopefully before you start the interviews, you can get on the same page. And so there's a lot of that interdisciplinary learning that I think ultimately just makes for a much better project. So we first asked people, how do you define drought, particularly in the Montana context? And this might seem like an obvious question. Some of you may be thinking, lack of water. But in the drought literature, lots of ink has actually been spilled on this question. What is a drought? How do we define a drought? And one of the interesting distinctions is whether drought is defined by its observed impacts or by its drivers, those sort of exposure elements that Molly was talking about earlier. So in terms of our results from our interviews, almost all of the interviewees defined drought through the impacts that they cared about. And I'll talk more about these specific impacts. But this is a common finding in the literature that people talk about drought in terms of its impacts. And some authors, Cole and Knox, they have a paper called My Drought is Not Your Drought, and that it really is the things that people value, the impacts of concern are how they might see and define a drought. But it is interesting to note that 2/3 of our interviewees also define drought by its drivers. And in many cases, this included mentioning how human land and water use can contribute to drought conditions. Another interesting thing to note from our interviews is that 1/5 of our interviewees mentioned climate change and/or ecological transformation in their definition of drought. So I think some people really are thinking about droughts of the future when they think about drought. And just a note of thanks for the image. Greg Peterson with the USGS had given a talk in my class a few years ago, and this image of projections for summer drought in the greater Yellowstone area is from a slide he had given with the images prepared by the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group. So from the list of drought impacts the interviewees mentioned, we categorize these impacts into impacts on human systems or impacts on ecosystems. And as you can see, some people mentioned only impacts on human systems, others mentioned only impacts on ecosystems, but nearly half of our interviewees mentioned impacts to both human and natural systems. And we even found evidence of awareness of ecological drought among managers who didn't explicitly have a role of managing ecosystems, so kind of more urban water supply or specifically agricultural management. And this is higher than we expected to find. A couple of our interviewees had worked in other states, Utah and Nevada, and they pointed out that, in those states, they felt that they were in their role really the main focus was on impacts to human communities and agriculture, but that in Montana they kind of felt there was something different going on, that there is a little more attention to the ecological impacts of drought. So we interpret this as a relatively integrated view of drought in this area. In terms of the specific impacts from the interviews, interviewees identified over 100 different impacts, ecological and otherwise. And in terms of the most commonly mentioned impacts that were mentioned by more than a third of the interviewees, 4 of them were ecological. So declining species health, mainly fisheries and aquatic species, increased water temperature, degradation of riparian areas, and wetlands. And then more on the human side, economic loss to recreational outfitters, generally water availability for people, and then recreational fishing, but more from a human-centric standpoint. So my colleague Amanda Cravens is working on writing up that vulnerability and perception piece. But with our colleague Nejam Rahim, who's an environmental economist, as Molly mentioned, at Emerson, we tried another approach to get at vulnerability assessments. And this is using this ecosystem services framework. So in addition to the interviews, Nejam and Molly and other folks helped to organize and structure a focus group or a participatory workshop, again, with partners from this larger Montana National Drought Resiliency Partnership. So folks came together, and the conference or workshop was structured around CCs, which is the Common International Classification of Ecosystem Services. And so folks who participated were asked to list ecosystem services or values and benefits that they get from the ecosystem in the Upper Missouri Headwaters. And then they were asked to think about 4 different categories, and this is part of that, the way ecosystem services are often structured. So supporting services, provisioning, regulating, and cultural services. And to list those across 3 different biomes. So across forests, grasslands and rangelands, rivers and riparian areas. And just a note in terms of the methods, so the ecosystem services approach, this workshop was just generating a list of services and benefits that people care about, not necessarily, at least not initially, worrying so much about whether these might be impacted by drought or not. So compared to the interviews where we specifically asked, what drought impacts are of concern to you. So then Nejam and Molly and Amanda, I don't know how much time they spent, but creating chart after chart and organizing these lists of services and benefits into these different subcategories of ecosystem services. And so this table gives you a sense of the kind of organization of the results. As a methodological exercise, and this is a paper that's currently under, it's been revised and hopefully will be out soon in Water Wires, but part of it is just to look at methods for conducting vulnerability assessments. And so comparing the types of responses that we got from the interviews, those on the right, the list of items that we got from the ecosystem services workshop that weren't in the interviews, and then where there was sort of overlap. And so I think what we have found is that adding an ecosystem services workshop like this adds more richness to sort of a more traditional vulnerability assessment, just asking different people and experts what is at risk. Oh, and I wanted to add too that we do all hope that this is helpful, because in our interactions with Ann Schwind, and she's leading this effort to get local watershed planners to develop local watershed drought plans. And in some of those meetings, some of the feedback that we often get is just sort of a starting point. These are often young people out in a community and are tasked with developing a drought plan, and just sort of wondering how to start. How do I even begin a vulnerability assessment? So hopefully these provide two different, starting points and ideas for how to go about maybe conducting a vulnerability assessment to get at some of these impacts of concern. So it's great that a wide range of people are interested and seem to be aware of the ecological impacts of drought, but is that translating into management? So that's kind of the next question. And in the drought planning literature, there's a principle that if you're not measuring or monitoring something through the use of indicators, it's unlikely to be effectively managed. So to get a sense of the indicators that are used in ecological drought, I'm going to turn to an analysis of some of the drought plans that we did. And so the questions we were asking for this part of the project is, do drought plans account for ecological impacts of drought? And if so, what indicators are used to monitor for ecological drought? And we did this by analyzing the 5 plans listed here, an older plan from 1988 on the Ruby River, as well as a very recent Beaverhead drought, watershed drought resiliency plan. You'll notice that the Blackfoot drought response plan is also listed up there. And for those of you who are likely aware that the Blackfoot is outside of the Upper Missouri Headwaters, but this plan is often held up by folks at the DNRC and other planners as kind of a model of a really excellent drought plan. And so we wanted to include that and look at what's in there and how that compares to these other drought plans. So we analyzed the drought plans using a qualitative software program called In Vivo, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But we coded or looked for themes in these plans, specifically around impacts and indicators. And our findings show that, yes, ecological drought is taken into account in these plans. However, it's through a very narrow lens of impacts to fish populations and fisheries. And so the way we scan the documents for any mention of impacts and indicators, and anytime an ecological impact was mentioned, it was given a 1. If it was discussed in some detail, it was given a 2, but it was only given a 3 if that impact was associated with an indicator. And so as you can see, the only item that was associated in these plans with an indicator was fish and fisheries. And the primary indicators that were used were stream flow levels, CFS, and water temperature. And from our interviews, and also from looking at some other resource management plans, we recognize that there are other indicators that could be used: soil moisture, normalized difference in vegetation index, evaporative demand, drought index. So there are more indicators out there, they're just not being used, at least not in these drought management plans. So our hypothesis is that there's a lot of richness in these other resource plans, BLM watershed assessments, forest plans, water quality plans, and that maybe by bringing together what's in these different plans, we can get a better view of the range of impacts, but also the range of indicators, and getting more communication between these plans and planners would be helpful. All right, so last but not least, and this is the very rough cut portion of my rough cut talk, I'm going to discuss some of the drought preparedness strategies that we've heard about in our interviews, as well as through looking through some of these plans. In the interviews, the questions that we asked are, what actions are you and your agency taking to prepare and also to respond to drought? And we really want to highlight that difference in the literature, the emphasis on preparatory actions you take before, as Molly mentioned. Now is the time to be thinking about drought before it occurs, rather than just reacting and responding once a drought has set in. And then we also asked about nature-based strategies that people were aware of to address drought. And I won't get into the details of the definition of nature-based strategy, but basically these are strategies that mimic or use nature, and ideally for the benefit of both human communities and natural communities. And we also asked about barriers and opportunities for these response actions. So the results, the rough results that I'm going to go through, the preliminary results here, come from the interviews that we conducted. But in the future, we'd also like to incorporate what we found in the drought plans, as well as this much this more massive project is looking through these large, these are usually 500-page forest plans, and we have some 54 odd other plans that we'd like to look through. So just a note on qualitative coding for folks in the room who aren't familiar with this. This is a screenshot from the qualitative software program called In Vivo. And coding, it's kind of a funny word. You might think we're like running computer code, but we're as the humans, as the interpreters, we're reading the transcripts, the written transcript from our interviews, and we're looking for themes. Some of them are deductive, so going into it based on the literature, based on what we're interested in. We already know we're looking for specific themes. So for example, assisted migration, or maybe it's as we read through the interviews, things come up more inductively and we create new themes as things emerge. And I want to give a big shout out to Dion Zoani. She was a graduate student who I had worked with on her master's, but she was then hired through our project to do some additional work. And she spent hours doing the initial coding of these interviews along all different categories, including looking for responses. And so just kind of a brief overview of this coding. So it's 44 interviews mentioned some kind of response, and then there were 2,288 mentions of some kind of drought response or solution. And then we categorize those more specifically, and then you can do a second round of coding and break apart, say, forest management into more specific kind of subcategories. So I'm just in the very early stages of getting back into this data. We have our final group meeting in February, so I will be working hard. This has been a good motivation for me to get back into the data and try and pull together some thoughts about what this data is saying. But in terms of the most commonly reported drought actions, based on the number of interviews that mentioned it, we've seen natural water storage, landscape restoration, having formal drought plans, information sharing, stream restoration, shared sacrifice, in-stream flows, water conservation, and mentions of flood pivot irrigation. So I'm going to go into these four in a little bit more detail. So within natural water storage, when secondary codes that were applied to that more specific, so aquifer recharge in general was mentioned, and then specifically beaver mimicry and beaver reintroduction were mentioned as strategies. And the idea is that you take an incised stream and build these beaver mimicry structures to reconnect the stream with the floodplain so that when there are floodwaters, it spills onto the bank and recharges the aquifer and stores the water underground. I would add that, so, one of the questions is which of these strategies might be considered nature-based strategies and which of them are proactive versus reactive. So I would categorize this as a nature-based strategy and a proactive strategy, the kinds of things that, as opposed to say high altitude, high mountain dams, something that might be more beneficial to both people and ecosystems. So another commonly mentioned strategy is shared sacrifice. And this also came up in our drought plans. In fact, the primary thing that the drought plans relied on in response to drought conditions were these voluntary reductions in irrigation diversions. And these are outlined in typically informal. They're sort of extra legal, technically per prior appropriation. It's kind of a use it or lose it. But communities and neighbors come together and agree that in times of shortage, they'll cut back, and it's these plans outline at what stage, at what CFS flow, at what temperature will people start to cut back. In other watersheds, especially the Big Hole is a good example where there is an endangered species, and so there has been efforts working ahead of time, or I should say threatened species that could be listed, the Arctic grayling, for example. So landowners and irrigators who are willing to work with the Fish and Wildlife Service can set up a, I always forget the name, it's CCAA, Conservation Agreement with Assurances, Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances. And these are more formal plans that they sort of sign off on with the Fish Wildlife Service and say, we'll implement these set of activities and practices and hope that this threatened species doesn't become endangered. But if it does, and it does get listed, we're not on the hook for doing anything else. We did what we could beforehand. But this is the idea behind these shared sacrifice agreements. So flood pivot irrigation was mentioned, and again, I need to get back into the data to figure out, you know, what exactly people were saying about it. But we've just from remembering some of the interviews, there is definitely some observations that as basins have switched from traditional flood irrigation to more efficient pivot irrigation, that there has been an observed reduction in late summer stream flows. And this phenomenon has been outlined in a couple of different reports, one being this report by the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization that basically interviewed 150 academics in 14 different countries about their experience with projects where more efficient high-tech irrigation has been adopted. And in most cases, the outcome is not necessarily more water saved that can be used for environmental flows or other sectors like urban use, but often it results in an increase in the amount of irrigated acreage and increased agricultural production. And then they also get into details about what we mean by consumed water. And I think that's really important to think about what's consumed by the plant and then what goes into the aquifer. So interesting questions around flood pivot irrigation. And then the last, no, this isn't the last one. Next is water conservation that was mentioned. Just sort of generally, also gray water use, limiting municipal use, and providing incentives for water conservation. And then the last two that I'm going to look at, they weren't among the most commonly mentioned, but I think it's interesting to think about just in terms of sectors and different management strategies, range and forest management. Some sub-codes or subcategories under range management include flexible stocking rates, grazing limits, rangeland health, grass banks, so keeping areas that aren't being used so that if a drought hits, you can move cattle there later, livestock rotation, riparian protection, and using invasive plants as feed. With one BLM manager that we spoke with, it was interesting when we asked about nature-based strategies, you know, would you categorize any of these as nature-based strategies? He said, you know, not really. I would just call these best management practices. You know, they're things we've known about, and we consider them best management practices. So I thought that was interesting. And then in terms of forest management, some things that were mentioned were tree thinning, fire management in general, and then more specifically allowing fires to burn and prescribed burns. So besides wrapping up the strategies and making more sense of some of these strategies that we heard about, the next steps in the project are to look at those larger resource planning documents, the 54 odd BLM plans, forest plans, and to try and institutionally map out how and by whom ecologically available water is managed by. And Teresa Jed with the National Drought Mitigation Center is leading that effort. And then also thinking about what types of ecological science is needed and how this compares with priorities that are being addressed by scientists, including the USGS. So this kind of science needs paper, Kim Hall with the Nature Conservancy and Shelley Crosby with Conservation Science Partners are taking the lead on that. I think we do have time for questions, and I think both Molly and I would be willing to answer questions if folks have any.
So you're asking lots of people about what they think about these things. So you're getting answers back. How much do you think about those answers are things that might be due to education and might be due to horrible education? It's always wrong. I make an extreme statement. But do you have that problem?
Yeah, well, our interviews are maybe a little different than sort of a generalized sample. So we were definitely targeting experts and folks from that list of partners partners in the National Drought Resiliency Program. And so, you know, we were interviewing people who I certainly have a bachelor's degree, probably graduate degrees, who work for various federal, state agencies and NGOs as well. So I would say our sample of our interviewees were a much more highly educated maybe than average group.
You are seeing difference. I mean, are you guys seeing differences in how water managers, natural resources sees drought? Are you looking at sort of those correlations? Not necessarily based on education level, but just based on
the role.
Their perspective.
Yeah, and that is definitely something that Amanda Cravens with the drought perception was looking at is, you know, based on the person's role, is someone maybe more likely to focus on human impacts, more likely to focus on ecological impacts, and that's what we expected. So we were kind of surprised and interested that, you know, half of our interviewees saw this sort of integrated human and natural set of impacts. And again, you know, maybe it's a Montana phenomenon, maybe it's because it's folks who are interested in the drought demonstration project, maybe it was because we told them we were doing an interview on ecological drought. You know, so there are certainly reasons that might be the case, but I do think there's evidence, and you know, I didn't mention this, but one of the reasons we focused, besides the fact that there's this drought resiliency partnership, one of our colleagues used to work with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the NIDIS program, the drought program through NOAA. And, you know, he deals with drought folks, drought planners, people who work in drought all over the world. And he just kind of had this feeling, I don't want to say gut feeling, had this feeling that, you know, Montana is different and that there is more of a focus on an awareness of ecological impacts. So that's something we sort of wanted to explore here. But I think, you know, in the future, it'd certainly be interesting to test in other regions that maybe aren't as attuned to.
Right, ask these same questions.
Mm-hmm.
I just wondered how much you're dealing with You showed a couple of projected maps of what it looked like, but how do you actually deal with that projection?
Yeah, we so in our interviews they were phone interviews and we didn't have any props or prompts. So we just open-endedly asked about drought, and if they brought up climate change as a factor, then it came from the interviewee. So as far as the interviews are concerned, we weren't necessarily framing them in terms of climate change. But I think maybe, can I turn over maybe the modeling efforts?
So I would say that, so there's a couple of things we have done. We have had some presentations and discussions with them about the projections and what it might be for the future here. But we have, for example, with Shelley's analyses of historic droughts, that is a more retrospective. The idea is, having done that analysis, you can think about what are the key drivers of drought on forest mortality and what are the future projections for those variables. We haven't yet done that. I think if there was interest, certainly in the community here, to work with us on trying to forecast more in the future, we'd be very interested in that. My own personal experience was that that so one of the ways we've actually brought up, and so we introduced this concept of the transformative drought. We really are trying to bring that into our discussions with drought planners, that droughts of the future are not going to look like droughts. So we can't just, I mean, that's one of my biggest concerns, is that people say, especially in communities in Montana and other places where, you know, we can't talk about climate change, but people are like, oh, but we're preparing for drought. And so we're kind of dealing with climate change by preparing for drought. But preparing for droughts in the past. In addition to the fact that drought's not the only impact of climate change I'm worried about. But so the challenge being, one of the things we have found some traction with is actually looking at the much longer paleo records of drought. And seeing, you know, several hundred years ago, I forget the exact time frame, No, with, there were some 30-year deep droughts in Montana. And that, it was a naturally occurring phenomenon that could happen again. And so getting people to just generally accept that droughts in the future may not be like 30 years, but because of climate change, but also because naturally we can is been part of what we're trying to bring into the conversation. We haven't necessarily brought it structured ways into our analyses, but it's definitely of interest to us.
Jamie, you mentioned tree restoration method. Historically, this is the valley of the flowers, grasses, and forests, and then turned into a lot of hay meadows, flood irrigated, returning water to the. Today, there are 3 5-acre ranches, trees pumping out landscape, lots of water. The county's looking at limiting landscaping.
The county level, kind of county ordinance. Yeah, not that I have come across. I have certainly not heard anything like that. Do you want to?
I mean, I'm not, definitely don't hear that discussed. So yeah, I mean, right, it's going to be hard, but I guess I do think conversation. I mean, I think what Jamie brought up about the whole switch was really important. There was a huge conversation about it at the State Water Forum last March that was run by state agencies about this paradox. There's this assumption when we switch to pivot that we're conserving more water, and we're really not. In a lot of places, a lot of cases, there's not more water in the stream for fish. There's not more water going into the discharge into the stream later in the summer. So, this sort of general concept of sort of how do we use water in a way that can active conversation right now. And it's really great to see them talking about natural water storage and tackling this challenge of irrigation. The answers, so at least people are talking about it.
And I would say our forest managers are more open and interested in this concept of thinning and thinking about ET, evapotranspiration rates, and the role that different species play and thinning plays, but the general public maybe less so.
I did, but we're out of time.
All right. Well,
So I think we better shut it down.
thank you for coming.